age 14. Unlike the vast majority of children of her time, Amelia was able to read and write at a competent rate. It was during this time that she would develop a love of literature and poetry.
Despite Amelia's comfortable childhood, she wasn't able to escape tragedy. One of her most influential moments as a young girl was witnessing the deterioration of her mother, Sarah, who contracted typhus fever at the age of 45. Once sick, Sarah began to go mad.
The disease caused her to experience delusions, hallucinations, and bouts of mania. Amelia, who was at times tasked to care for her mother, watched firsthand as Sarah slowly lost her mind. Epidemic typhus was common in overcrowded, impoverished areas like Pile Marsh and carried a 60% chance of mortality.
Given the poor, unsanitary conditions of Victorian England, it isn't hard to imagine Amelia's mother succumbing to the disease quickly. Amelia felt helpless to stop it.
Vanessa's going to take over the psychology here and throughout the episode. Please note that Vanessa is not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, but she has done a lot of research for this show.
Thanks, Greg. Childhood trauma can have a lasting effect on serial killers as they develop. In the 2014 article, Neurodevelopmental and Psychosocial Risk Factors in Serial Killers and Mass Murderers, researchers note how psychosocial stressors included significant traumatic events during childhood, such as the death of a close family member, major surgery or illness, psychological, physical, and/or sexual abuse. Given Amelia's relatively privileged upbringing, it isn't hard to imagine how such a shocking event, like watching her mother's mental deterioration and eventual death, could have stuck with her. This trauma could have altered her understanding of the harsh world around her and primed her to kill later in life.
Yet there was one advantage to watching her mother's descent into insanity. Amelia learned what symptoms of mental illness looked like. She committed them to memory, in case she ever had to feign illness herself.
After her mother died in 1848, Amelia was sent to live with her aunt in Bristol and worked as an apprentice to a corset maker. During this period, for whatever reason, she became estranged from the rest of her family. She rarely communicated with her father or siblings.
In 1859, her father died of bronchitis, and her older brother inherited their father's shoe business.
At 24, Amelia moved to a lodging house at number 2 Trinity Street. It was here that she began seeing a man named George Thomas, a 57-year-old boarder. George Thomas was a master carver and gilder who had recently buried his wife. He and Dyer began a relationship, and 5 months after his first wife's death, George and Amelia were married.
Interestingly enough, both Amelia and George lied about their ages on their marriage certificate. Amelia, who was 24 at the time, said she was 30, and George said he was 48. The marriage itself was unusually unceremonious. They married at the Bristol Register Office, and neither had family members present at the ceremony. Amelia maintains that by this time, she was estranged from the rest of her family, though she never said why.
A couple of years into their marriage, Amelia entered the Bristol Royal Infirmary and began training as a nurse. The career move made some sense. She was a natural caregiver, as evidenced by the way she took care of her mother during her mother's illness. Nursing as a profession was becoming an increasingly respectable career, thanks in large part to the efforts of nurse and social activist Florence Nightingale.
Victorian England was in a period of massive industrialization, especially in the larger cities. Because of that, there was a huge class discrepancy between the high class, the working class, and the poor. The vast majority of people were quite poor and either lived on the streets, in cramped lodging houses, or the workhouse.
Working class men usually fell into 3 categories: laborers, artisans, or educated working class. There was a wide range of ways to make an honest living, from selling food and goods from carts to finding your way, if possible, into such industries as piano manufacturing, silk weaving, or brewing.
But for women like Amelia, surviving in a big city like London wasn't always so easy, especially if you were among the poor or working class. Selling flowers, delivering milk, a profession rarely done by men in those days, or servitude were all means to an end. But the 2 most common careers for women were in the factory or in the streets. Many women found themselves working in factories for long, arduous hours, operating machinery and breathing in toxic fumes. The conditions were absolutely terrible. Just as terrible was the rampant rise in sex work. It is said that 1 in 12 women in Victorian England was a sex worker.
So when Florence Nightingale returned from the Crimean War and established the School of Nursing at St. Thomas Hospital in 1860, it opened up a new profession for women. The school drastically changed the way nursing was perceived. Amelia eagerly dove into the burgeoning profession when she signed up to train at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. It may not have been glamorous work, but it provided Amelia with an honest living.
Life as a nurse was tough. Most of the time, Amelia would work 16-hour shifts from morning until late into the evening. Amelia learned that one of the most important aspects of being a nurse was to be emotionally distant with those under her care. She grew a tough exterior and became quite independent.
And while Amelia would never learn general medical knowledge, as that was strictly intended for doctors, she did become well acquainted with anesthetics and the ability to relieve pain and infection. And as a nurse, she would also learn the basic duties of being a midwife.
At the age of 26, Amelia became pregnant with her first child. When she was unable to hide her pregnancy, she was forced to stop working as a nurse and relied on the income of her husband, George. In 1864, Amelia gave birth to a little girl, Ellen Thomas.
But her bouncing new baby wasn't the only significant life change Amelia underwent.
Around the same time, she met a midwife by the name of Ellen Dane. This meeting would alter the course of Amelia's life.
Ellen Dane was a midwife who briefly stayed with Amelia and George in Bristol. As a midwife, Ellen's profession was to assist a woman's pregnancy and help in the birth of the child. As part of her own nursing training, Amelia would have learned the duties of a midwife and thus be familiar with Ellen Dane's profession. However, Miss Dane usually did more than just care for the child. Many of the women who sought her out did so with the hopes of discretion, given that the pregnancies were out of wedlock.
Amelia discovered that Dane provided another service for these women with illegitimate babies, one that proved to be a lucrative venture: baby farming.
In 1834, 3 years before Amelia was born, Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, commonly known as the New Poor Law. Part of this law said that a father was no longer financially obligated to raise an illegitimate son or daughter. Essentially, a man could get a woman he was not married to pregnant and never have to support her monetarily. The aim, of course, was to curb premarital relationships and moral decay.
Poverty was rampant in England at the time, and one of the biggest groups to suffer from it was children. Because many women couldn't afford to care for their children, they were often left on the streets. As Amelia walked around Bristol or London, she would have constantly been hounded by children, begging for money to buy food. Or worse, she would have seen the bodies of dead children in the gutters.
In fact, the New Poor Law failed to stop or slow down the rate of illegitimate births. By the time Amelia met Ellen Dane in the mid-1860s, illegitimate pregnancies and births were actually on the rise.
As the problem became a crisis, pioneering women began developing a profession that would come to be known as baby farming. Essentially, for a reasonable fee, pregnant women seeking discretion would pay women like Ellen Dane to take the newborn baby and find it an adoptive home.
It was an easy way to make money and provided the new mothers with some solace. Amelia became intrigued. Ellen was happy to show her the ins and outs of baby farming. She also bragged about the money that came with it. But that wasn't the only secret of the trade Ellen had to reveal. Amelia was about to learn that this industry was far from the humane solution it was propped up to be.
It was something altogether insidious, and Amelia was ready to dive right in.
We'll learn the ins and outs of this heinous business in a moment. Now, back to the story.
In 1864, around the time Amelia gave birth to her first child, at the age of 26, she met a midwife who also acted as a baby farmer.
Baby farmers provided a sigh of relief for young, destitute mothers who wished to keep their illegitimate pregnancies secret. But for Amelia, it quickly proved to be a way to make some fast cash.
In fact, orphanages would eventually turn away a child if they knew it was born out of wedlock. only accepting children from single mothers if they knew the father had passed away. In these harsh times, many mothers would have the child and then abandon it on the streets to die.
A news report from the Clifton Chronicle from 1856 reads, quote, "On Saturday morning, the body of an infant was discovered, wrapped in an old newspaper, lying in the path from the observatory to Clifton Down." End quote. Articles like these were not uncommon.
If a mother didn't leave the child on the street, oftentimes she would smother the child herself. The advent of baby farming offered a heartening alternative to the merciless realities of living in Queen Victoria's England.
Ellen Dane originally hailed from Southport, England, before she came to live with Amelia and George as a boarder. Shortly after moving in, Ellen Dane showed Amelia how to use her home as a baby farm.
Amelia quickly learned that her friend was anything but a savior to these struggling women. While some baby farmers did act honestly, Ellen Dane was one of many who did not.
Dane would neglect the baby and pocket the fee intended to pay for their care. Ellen would underfeed them, give them doses of alcohol and opiates, or smother them to death.
And when the baby eventually died, the death certificate would read that the child simply wasted away. Because the mother had already abandoned the baby, no one would be actively looking for the child nor miss it. The baby would simply vanish. It was an easy, albeit heartless, way to earn some money if the situation ever called for it.
That situation would come sooner rather than later. On October 18, 1869, Amelia's husband George passed away at the age of 67. Amelia was now a young widow with a child to care for.
By all accounts, Amelia could have returned to being a nurse or reached out to her estranged family for help. But Amelia almost immediately turned to baby farming as a way to make ends meet. The instant payment was too tempting to turn away.
Amelia fits the profile of two types of female serial killers, a profit killer and the angel of death. Profit killers kill solely for the purpose of making money. According to Michael D. Kelleher and C.L. Kelleher in their 1998 book, Murder Most Rare, The Female Serial Killer, the definition of this type of killer is a woman who systematically murders individuals for profit. These women are entirely emotionless and lack any kind of compassion, all things that Amelia learned how to be while training as a nurse.
Before opening up her home to baby farming, Amelia decided that it would be best to get rid of her daughter, Ellen. In 1869, Amelia farmed out her daughter to someone else.
Amelia's decision to farm out her daughter didn't come from a place of protection. She wasn't attempting to shield the young child from the heinous crime she was about to commit. Rather, it meant one less mouth to feed around the house, and more money in her market.
It's unclear exactly to whom Amelia farmed her daughter. However, in an 1871 census, Ellen Thomas is listed as an orphan living in Stoke Bishop, just outside of Bristol.
According to the Kellehers, profit killers like Amelia are also typically organized, intelligent, resourceful, and careful in carrying out her crimes. Consequently, she's slow to be suspected of foul play and will often prove to be a difficult adversary for law enforcement personnel. Amelia was all of these things: smart, organized, resourceful, and elusive. One of the key elements to her business began the moment she opened up shop. She used aliases when placing advertisements and dealing with clients.
Amelia placed her first advertisement towards the end of 1869, shortly after George's death. In her advertisements, Amelia volleyed between the names Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Smith.
By using multiple fake names, Amelia was able to protect her real identity and avoid detection from the authorities. She distanced herself from her criminal activity, a smart and calculated move by any profit killer.
One such advertisement read, quote, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home. Terms £10. Harding, care of Ship's Letter Exchange, Stokes Croft, Bristol." End quote. Amelia would charge anywhere between £10 to £80 per baby, or about $1,300 to $10,000 today.
After an advertisement was placed, a woman in need would respond. If she was in the later stages of her pregnancy, she would move in with Amelia in her home in Totterdown, a suburb of Bristol. Once the baby was born, she offered to care for the child for a weekly fee, or adopt it outright for a one-time higher fee.
Or if the mother answering the advertisement already had the child, Amelia would offer to foster the baby and find a couple to adopt it. It's unclear exactly how many babies she had at a time, but it's easy to assume that she had a full house.
There was never any rhyme or reason as to when she decided to kill, or which method she would employ. It could be that the house was getting too full, and she needed to make room. Or a bill was due soon and she needed money right away. Sometimes she got annoyed with how loudly a baby cried. Her methods came straight from what she learned from Ellen Dane: suffocation, starvation, and poison.
If she chose to suffocate the child, sometimes she would do it as she was helping the mother give birth. As the baby exited the womb, she would smother it and prevent the baby from taking its first breath, so it would appear to be stillborn. This act also fits another female serial killer classification: child care angels.
According to criminal profiler Pat Brown, child care angels are serial killers, primarily women with nursing backgrounds, who smother newborns. She explains that signs of suffocation will appear differently in infants than with adults. Because of this, it becomes harder to tell when a baby has been murdered when examined by a doctor. Amelia knew exactly how to fool the mother and the doctor signing the death certificate into thinking that the child was a stillbirth and not a murder victim.
But if the babies were already born and fell into her care, she would sometimes starve them to death.
The cries in her house would grow louder and louder, but Amelia would just stare at the babies with indifference, ignoring their pleas for food. Eventually, the crying always stopped, and Amelia would find another baby to take its place.
Unlike many serial killers who plot out their kill and make it a monumental event, Amelia's murder spree was a daily occurrence. Round the clock, she was surrounded by babies, slowly killing them one by one. She saw them as capital.
She often used a poison called Godfrey's cordial, an opium-based medicine given to newborns and young children in the 19th century. It contained heavy doses of opium. Amelia would fill a spoon with the drug and ease it into the baby's mouth. The baby would quickly fall asleep and never wake up.
It is hard to understand today how a woman, especially a nurse, would be okay with the murder of an innocent child. But Amelia's attitudes toward infanticide reflected her time, and legally, proving that a baby was murdered was difficult to do, making it hard to charge a baby farmer with murder.
Tragically, the death of infants in Victorian England was often seen as a blessing in disguise for both the mother and the baby. Even a clergyman, when discussing the death of a baby to his congregation, preached that the child's death allowed the mother to easily have returned to the path of honest industry.
Death was a daily occurrence in Victorian England. As a nurse, Amelia had learned to stay emotionally detached from her patients, babies included. Given her training and her society's general attitude towards infant death, it's easy to see how Amelia would have no remorse in taking the life of a newborn.
And she was well paid for her crimes. At the time, the typical working woman could expect to make about £1 a week. Amelia's baby farm yielded her a minimum of £5 per baby.
But another element may have contributed to Amelia's remorseless attitude toward murdering children. Around the time she began her first baby farm, in late 1869, Amelia began taking a drug known as laudanum.
Laudanum was cheap and popular at this time. It was an opium-based drug with morphine and codeine, making it highly addictive.
Laudanum was overprescribed to relieve pain in just about everything: toothaches, headaches, insomnia, you name it. Addiction became rampant, especially among women. Depression, hysteria, menstrual pains, dysmorphia. If there was an ailment, all a woman needed to do was take some laudanum.
Parliament would eventually pass the Pharmacy Act, aimed to restrict the availability of drugs like laudanum. But for Amelia, a nurse, getting her hands on a bottle wouldn't have been too difficult. There is speculation that her addiction to the opium and morphine may have helped her to emotionally weather the heinous act of murdering infants.
A year into Amelia's baby farm business, her mentor, Ellen Dane, would have to flee England for the United States. Word was getting out about Dane's operation, and she couldn't chance arrest. History would never hear from her again.
The possible capture of her friend should have made Amelia second-guess her baby farm, but it never did. She knew that her aliases protected her from any link to Dane, but it would be the arrest and subsequent trial of another baby farmer that would provide the first clue to Amelia's operation and send her into hiding.
We'll learn which clues helped police connect the dots in a minute.
Now, back to the story.
Margaret Waters, born in 1835, was a baby farmer who lived and operated in Brixton, South London. Like Amelia Dyer, she began baby farming after her husband died to make ends meet.
As Amelia was beginning her own baby farm in the late 1860s, the two kept a business correspondence and farmed out some of the same babies together. Like Amelia, Margaret would kill the babies through starvation or poison. But unlike Amelia, Margaret had the help of her sister, Sarah Ellis.
What led to Margaret's downfall was doing business with a client who wished to keep tabs on the baby being farmed, an anomaly when it came to baby farming.
In May of 1870, Robert Cohen discovered that his 17-year-old daughter was pregnant, and he decided to seek out help to hide her indiscretion. He saw an advertisement that read, quote, "Adoption. A respectable couple desire the entire charge of a child to bring up as their own. They are in a position to offer every comfort," end quote. Except Mrs. Willis was actually Amelia's friend, Margaret Waters.
Margaret agreed to take in the child, John Walter Cohen. Not long after delivering the child to Margaret, Robert offered to give her more money if he were allowed to come and visit John to check and see how he was doing. Margaret didn't like this idea one bit, because little John was slowly starving to death at her house. To Margaret Waters' misfortune, Robert Cohen was becoming a rogue client and proved hard to shake.
Sensing that something was amiss, Robert Cohen and the police arrived at Margaret's house on June 11, 1870. They knocked at number 4 Frederick Terrace, Brixton, and made a shocking discovery. 10 babies, John Cohen among them, were on the verge of dying from neglect and starvation. In almost every case, the baby was drugged with laudanum. A doctor who was brought to the scene saw John Cohen's frail body and immediately rushed him to a trusted wet nurse. But despite being washed and cared for, John died.
Amelia, now in her early 30s, would read about Margaret and Sarah's arrest in the papers. When the trial began in September, it was a media sensation. For the first time, the public became aware of the insidious actions of some baby farmers.
One of the more damning moments of the trial was the testimony of Dr. George Puckle, the doctor at the scene of the discovery and arrest. In reference to little John Cohen, Dr. Puckle said, quote, "The body was extremely emaciated, the bones almost protruding through the skin. It was miserably wasted, and nothing but skin and bone. I was in the house nearly half an hour, and there was no crying or motion from any of them." End quote.
Amelia learned of revelations that, unbeknownst to authorities, directly connected her with Margaret. She got nervous. A mutual associate, Dr. William Harding, was being investigated for the death of an actress due to a failed abortion. It was during this investigation that Harding recounted a story of an illegitimate baby he delivered a year prior. The nurse who helped with the delivery was Mrs. Harding, one of Amelia's aliases.
He said Mrs. Harding took the baby and eventually farmed the child out to Margaret Waters. It's unknown if the baby died while in Margaret's care, but police never bothered to investigate Dr. Harding's testimony. To Amelia's relief, she had dodged a bullet.
Margaret's sister, Sarah Ellis, was ultimately acquitted of murder, but pled guilty to fraud in connection to the baby farming. She would be sentenced to 18 months of hard labor. Margaret Waters, on the other hand, was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang.
On October 11, 1870, Amelia would wake up to learn that her business associate, Margaret Waters, was executed at Horsemonger Lane Jail, Southwark. The Brixton baby farmer's reign of terror had been cut short. And while she was only convicted of one murder, it's believed Margaret was responsible for the deaths of 19 babies. a number that would soon pale in comparison to Amelia.
Not long after Margaret's execution, the newspapers began reporting more extensively on Margaret Waters' baby farming network. Letters would be discovered, always addressed to two names, Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Smith of Bristol.
Despite Dr. Harding's testimony and these newly discovered letters, Amelia was never visited by police. In fact, Amelia's role in these heinous crimes was never suspected. But the media scrutiny that came with Margaret's trial made Amelia question whether it was still a good idea to baby farm. The money was good and the work was easy, but was it worth risking the noose?
She decided it might be time to lay low and go back to more honest work, which for Amelia meant a trip to the insane asylum.
In 1871, 34-year-old Amelia became a nurse's attendant at the Bristol Lunatic Asylum. Amelia found the work to be very similar to that of her nursing career.
In other words, hard and arduous. Brutally long hours for little pay. But it did give Amelia a place to stay and, given her background in nursing, came quite easy to her. She became well acquainted with the various means of restraint, especially when dealing with violent patients. Straitjackets, preventative gloves, metal cuffs, like something out of a horror movie.
The majority of her time was spent cleaning and feeding patients, overseeing outdoor activities for patients, bathing patients. The job paid only £1 every month, considerably less than the £5 per baby she was making as a farmer.
Amelia's patients were women and generally consisted of suicidal maniacs, a descriptor no longer used in modern psychology, or those that suffered from melancholy. Some of the patients exhibited the same symptoms that her mother suffered before she died. It wasn't long before Amelia grew tired of the job and began looking for another line of work.
Yet, Amelia saw the benefits of the insane asylum. The more she studied how the patients acted and how they were treated, the more she realized that life as a patient wasn't all that bad. It may have been boring, but it provided a place to live, hot meals, and some recreational entertainment. Amelia would always keep that in the back of her mind. If she needed to get away, the asylum wasn't such a bad place to end up. Better than prison, at least.
She remembered the way her mother acted as she was slowly losing her mind from typhus fever. Amelia studied how the patients were treated at the Bristol Asylum. It cannot be understated how smart and calculating Amelia was. She would make sure to use her time at the asylum to her advantage should the occasion ever call for it.
Life as a nurse wouldn't last long. By the beginning of 1872, Amelia was no longer working at the Bristol Lunatic Asylum. It's unclear if she was let go or if she quit, but records indicate that she was no longer employed there.
But 1872 wasn't an entirely bad year for Amelia. At some point, she became reunited with her daughter Ellen. She also married her second husband that fall.
William Dyer was a 27-year-old, unskilled and illiterate laborer who worked in a sugar refinery. Status-wise, a step down from George. He was also 8 years younger than her, though he wouldn't know that since she told him that she was 29. In 1873, Amelia would give birth to their first child together, Mary Ann, who would go by Polly, and a few years later she would give birth to a son, William Samuel.
During their first years of marriage, they would rely on William's meager income and make a little extra cash renting out their spare room. However, 5 years into their marriage, William lost his job at the sugar refinery. Eventually, he found work again in a vinegar brewery.
But with a full house and a looming financial crisis, Amelia made the decision to return to her old business of baby farming. In 1877, nearly 6 years since she closed up her first baby farm, her old ads went into the newspaper.
She reopened her baby farm in Bristol and quickly found her stride. Place an advertisement in paper, accept the baby, kill the child, pocket the money, repeat.
It's hard to say how many pregnant women and newborn babies Amelia took in when she first became a baby farmer. But thanks to the recollections of Polly Dyer, we're able to get some sense as to how often she was taking in babies.
It is believed Amelia would house up to 6 babies at a time. Assuming she charged her £5 minimum per baby, she would have made £35 every month or two. compared to the measly 12 pounds a year she was making at the Bristol Lunatic Asylum.
Everything about Amelia Dyer's baby farm operation checks the boxes of a classic female for-profit killer. According to Michael and C.L. Kelleher in their book Murder Most Rare, this is largely seen in Amelia's detachment towards her victims and ease in associating their deaths with money.
But for as smart and calculated as she was, she became increasingly addicted to laudanum, and it was starting to become apparent. It's noted that her daughters, especially Polly, were more aware that she was drinking the drug straight from the bottle.
It is very possible, too, that Amelia's addiction to laudanum drove her need to accept babies into her home constantly. She needed money to fuel a drug addiction that left her emotionally numb, able to carry on with the murder of these innocent children, which, in turn, could have driven her need for laudanum.
Even more insidious, Amelia recruited the help of her daughter Ellen to care for the children. Ellen had no idea what exactly her mother was doing. Polly would remember the influx of babies and the new mothers, but never thought twice about the babies no longer crying in the evening.
She would remember how she and Ellen would be sent to the apothecary to pick up bottles of Godfrey's cordial. And with a little bit of the medicine, the babies would be as quiet as a mouse.
For roughly 2 years, Amelia managed to run her baby farm without any trouble from the authorities. She was smart in how she was able to avoid the police using fake names. She never seemed to fear that the link between her and Margaret Waters would catch up with her.
But as the old adage goes, nothing lasts forever.
When a baby died, a doctor and undertaker would be called to the house. The doctor would inspect the baby and then declare the cause of death. But in the middle of 1879, a doctor that frequented Amelia's home noticed that 4 babies had died in her care in the span of 2 weeks.
The doctor found it odd that so many babies should die in such a short amount of time while in the care of a well-trained nurse. There had to be more to it.
The doctor went to the authorities and raised suspicions about Amelia Dyer. A few days later, Amelia's house was raided by police and a doctor. They found the bodies of the dead infants, inexplicably still in Amelia's home. Knowing this may very well be the end, Amelia decided to take matters into her own hands.
When the police returned a few days after their initial raid, they discovered Amelia had drank 2 full bottles of laudanum in a suicide attempt. For most people, 2 bottles would have done the job, but Amelia's tolerance for the drug was sky high. It barely put her down for a nap.
Between the 4 infantile deaths and the attempt on her own life, investigators believed they had a case. In August of 1879, Amelia was arrested and charged for violating the Infant Life Protection Act of 1872, an offense that could see Amelia walking to the gallows.
But to Amelia's surprise, the evidence against her proved to be mostly circumstantial. Even though the bodies appeared to have been drugged and starved, there wasn't any actual proof that Amelia gave the babies poison or refused to feed them. In the eyes of the court, Amelia was just a bad caregiver.
She managed to escape the hangman's noose and was instead found guilty of gross negligence. She was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor at the Shepton Mallet prison.
Even though Amelia dodged a capital offense, life wasn't going to be easy for her. For 6 months, she was going to be staying at one of the harshest and oldest prisons in England. Men, women, and even children were exposed to back-breaking work and abysmal living conditions within its walls.
In February of 1880, Amelia Dyer was released from Shepton Mallet Prison, beaten, battered, and bruised.
Many would claim that she lost her mind while performing hard labor.
Prison didn't reform Amelia. If anything, it inspired her to change her methods to avoid detection and emboldened her to murder even more. She was going to return to her baby farm, only she would be smarter about it.
Next week, we'll take a look into how Amelia continued her killing spree unabated for another 16 years.
Hundreds of unwitting mothers would soon hand their children over to Amelia, and each of those children would die at Amelia's hands. Soon, the River Thames would overflow with infant bodies, victims of the merciless baby killer of Bristol.
Thanks again for tuning in to Female Criminals and Serial Killers. Join us next time as we continue to explore the heinous crimes of baby farmer Amelia Dyer.
Thanks again for joining us today, Sammy.
Of course, I'm excited to come back next week.
And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Female Criminals.
You can find Female Criminals, Serial Killers, and all of Parcast's other podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, CastBox, TuneIn, or your favorite podcast directory.
Many of you have asked how to help the podcasts, and if you enjoy them, the best way to help is to leave a 5-star review.
We'll see you next time.
Have a killer week.
Female Criminals and Serial Killers were created by Max Cutler, are a production of Cutler Media, and are part of the Parcast network. They're produced by Max and Ron Cutler, sound design by Carrie Murphy, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro and Paul Mahler. Additional production assistance by Maggie Admire and Carly Madden. This episode was written by Joe Guerra and stars Vanessa Richardson, Sammy Nye, and Greg Polson. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of murder and assault that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under 13.
When tiny Helena Fry first gazed upon Amelia Dyer, she had no idea she was staring into the face of her killer. Rather, she saw a homely, 59-year-old woman that gave off a grandmotherly warmth.
The elderly woman made baby Helena laugh. Helena smiled as she looked back at her mother, but her mother wasn't smiling.
Instead, her mother kissed baby Helena goodbye and left the tiny cottage. As Helena's mother disappeared from view, Helena began to cry.
But her cries were quickly stifled as the old woman wrapped tape around the baby's neck and pulled.
Helena Fry was one of Amelia Dyer's final victims. Her decomposed body, stashed in a brown paper parcel, was discovered in the Thames hours after it had been thrown into the river. This discovery led police directly to the doorstep of one of history's most prolific serial killers. I'm Greg Polson.
And I'm Vanessa Richardson. Welcome to part 2 of our special crossover episode of Serial Killers and Female Criminals on the Parcast Network. Today, the show where we delve into the minds and madness of notorious killers meets the show where we examine the psychology and atrocities of female criminals. We're joined by my female criminals co-host, Sammy Nye.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
I've brought together my co-hosts Greg and Sammy to explore the crimes of Amelia Dyer, the notorious 19th century baby farmer who murdered between 300 and 400 babies over the span of nearly 30 years.
If you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe to Female Criminals to hear Vanessa and Sammy explore the stories and psychology of other dangerous women.
You can find Female Criminals, Serial Killers, and all of Parcast's other shows on your favorite podcast directory.
At Parcast, we're grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network.
And if you enjoy serial killers or female criminals, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help us. We also now have merch. Head to parcast.com/merch for more information.
Now let's continue the horrifying story of Amelia Dyer.
Amelia Dyer began her baby farm murder spree in 1869. She turned her home into her own private murder house, killing as many as 400 babies over the span of 30 years.
Due to overpopulation and extreme poverty, baby farming was a relatively common enterprise in Victorian England. Young, often unwed mothers would pay a baby farmer to take their unwanted child and find them adoptive parents. But instead of caring for these children, Amelia would kill them, pocket the cash, and quickly fill the empty crib with a new victim.
Her methods were abhorrent. She would strangle, starve, or poison the babies, then discard their bodies in the River Thames.
Last week, we discussed Amelia's upbringing. How, when she was 14, she witnessed the slow mental deterioration and death of her mother, Sarah, due to typhus fever. Amelia later became a nurse, but lost her job when she became pregnant with her first child. She and her husband George had to rent out their spare bedroom to make ends meet.
One of their first boarders was a midwife named Ellen Dane, who opened Amelia's eyes to the lucrative and sinister industry of baby farming.
When Amelia's husband died in 1869, she opened her own baby farm to support herself financially.
Vanessa's going to take over on the psychology here and throughout the episode. Please note that Vanessa is not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, but she has done a lot of research for this show.
Thanks, Sammy. As we discussed last week, Amelia Dyer was a for-profit killer. According to doctors Michael D. Kelleher and C.L. Kelleher, she was, quote, strongly motivated by financial gain and was able to structure her crimes to be as covert as possible. She was able to organize all the details necessary to avoid drawing attention to herself.
But in 1879, a local doctor grew suspicious when he noted that 4 babies had died in Amelia's care in the span of 2 weeks. He reported her to the authorities and she was arrested, but was convicted not of infanticide, but of negligence.
Her sentence was 6 months of hard labor at Shepton Mallet Prison, England's most notorious, brutal penitentiary.
This week, we'll explore Amelia's short-lived attempt at honest work after her prison stint, and how her insatiable greed drove her to murder hundreds.
Following her 6-month stay at the Shepton Mallet Prison in 1879, Amelia Dyer was noticeably disturbed. Months of hard labor, picking oakum for 6 to 8 hours a day, had worn on her. Not to mention the painful addiction withdrawal she would have suffered, cut off from opium for the better part of a year. But while an arduous stay in a notoriously filthy prison should have convinced anyone to stop killing babies for money, the experience merely tempered Amelia Dyer's criminal career.
When Amelia returned home from prison, she did attempt to make an honest living, at least for a little while.
Amelia returned to one of her earliest jobs, one that she'd learned when she was a teenager living with her aunt: corset making.
She found a job as a corset-making foreman at a workhouse. Like her position as a nurse, the hours were long, arduous, and provided little pay. To the surprise of no one, Amelia didn't stay at this job for very long.
To add to their financial stress, the shame of Amelia being labeled the tottered-down baby farmer was hard on Amelia's family. It's believed that the scrutiny forced Amelia's daughter Ellen to run away. She was rarely heard from again. Amelia and William, Amelia's second husband, decided to move the family away from Totterdown. But without steady work, they were forced to move from place to place around Bristol, never staying in one home for long.
For 3 years, Amelia faced failure after failure in her attempt to live by the law. The final straw came in 1884, when she attempted to open and run a general store. The store's quick demise convinced Amelia that earning an honest wage was never going to happen for her. She grew increasingly cynical about her prospects, and she always knew in the back of her mind how easy it was to make money as a baby farmer.
So in 1884, she began taking in babies. However, she was determined to never get caught again. She decided to change her methods to elude any kind of suspicion.
First, Amelia began targeting women of a more respectable class. Unlike the destitute women seeking to unburden themselves from the financial responsibility of a child, Amelia's new clients were hoping to keep the evidence of an extramarital affair in the dark. And with a wealthier client base came a higher fee. She started charging £80 per baby. And in almost all the letters she responded to, she insisted on straight-out adoption instead of a temporary foster.
Amelia also changed up her methods of killing and corpse disposal. Public perception towards infanticide had changed since she last baby farmed, 5 years previous. Now, a baby that appeared to have been abused could be reported to the authorities, and the caregiver could face legal consequences. If Amelia was caught with a sickly-looking baby, she could have been punished for neglect.
She knew that the last thing she needed was more attention. But Amelia also realized that the quicker a baby was disposed of, the quicker she could bring in another. Instead of poisoning or starving the baby to death, she began to outright strangle them. She took a piece of tape, wrapped it around the baby's neck, and pulled until the baby stopped breathing. Once the baby died, Amelia would forego seeking a doctor to write up a death certificate, and instead place the baby in a box or bag, weigh it down with bricks, and throw it into the Thames.
Amelia later admitted that she enjoyed watching the babies suffer as they died. It is possible that today she would have been categorized as someone with sadistic personality disorder. The controversial diagnosis, included only in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition revised, states that one of the traits for SPD includes amusement or pleasure at the psychological or physical suffering of others. Not only did Amelia enjoy killing her victims, but with each new baby she killed, she became increasingly desensitized to the act itself.
Another widely speculated belief was that her addiction to laudanum, which was back in full swing by 1884, may have numbed her to the horror of killing a baby. Laudanum gives off a euphoric sensation when used in heavy doses. The euphoric sensation may have played into the pleasure Amelia sometimes felt when she strangled babies.
Throughout the rest of the 1880s, Amelia and her family moved from house to house around Bristol. In each home, she would baby farm. Aside from the frequent moves, Amelia and her family faced few problems. For 6 years, the family lived comfortably and never faced any kind of financial crisis or scrutiny from the authorities. But that was about to change.
As a farmer, Amelia made an agreement with her clients. It was generally understood that they would never see their baby again. But even with the social pressures put on women of a higher class, not all of them wished to sever ties with their illegitimate children.
Generally speaking, Amelia was able to lie her way out of letting these women see their babies.
But in early 1890, a young, educated, and unnamed governess, hailing from Exeter, began a correspondence with Amelia that would change her life forever. The governess revealed that she had become pregnant, and the father was the son of her boss. A marriage proposal between the two was suggested, but her boss hated the idea, as he believed the governess was of a lower class than them. The son was forced to move away, and the governess became jobless. Amelia agreed to take the child for £15, with the final payment occurring 2 months after the baby was born.
The governess moved in with Amelia and her family in their Horfield house, near fish ponds. Within those 6 months, Amelia had managed to convince the governess to trust her entirely. She swore that she would care for the baby as if it were her own. The governess bought into it, hook, line, and sinker.
Towards the end of the summer, the governess moved out of the Dyer home. A few weeks afterward, she returned to make her final payment, but things quickly went awry when she asked to see her baby one last time.
Amelia brought her a child, but the governess quickly realized that the baby Amelia was holding wasn't hers. Amelia tried to lie her way out of the situation, claiming that babies change as they get older.
But the governess didn't buy it. She inspected the baby's hip for a birthmark she remembered the baby having. Her fears were confirmed. This wasn't her child.
The governess refused to pay Amelia a single cent until she could see her actual baby. Little did she know, the infant was already at the bottom of a river. Amelia had a problem on her hands.
For days, Amelia was hounded by the governess. To complicate matters, the father of the baby had recently been given permission to marry the governess. So he also started dogging Amelia for answers.
She was trapped. In an act of desperation, she told the governess that she had given the baby up for adoption to a couple who lived on a farmhouse. The couple had seen Amelia with the baby on a train platform and convinced her to give the baby up right then and there. Skeptical of her story, the governess and her husband decided to follow the lead.
Which, of course, didn't pan out. A few weeks later, the couple was back on Amelia's doorstep. This time, she told them that the baby was given up for adoption in Bristol.
They went round and round like this for months, until the governess and her husband finally brought the matter to police. At the beginning of 1891, the police paid a visit to Amelia's house. There was just one problem. Amelia was gone.
William told the authorities that Amelia had died. her baby farming business along with her. The police bought it, even if the governess didn't.
In reality, Amelia was hiding. She had fled in the middle of the night to a boarding house in Woodhill, a beautiful coastal town not far from Bristol.
She hid there for the better part of the year, working as a nurse. And somewhat unexpectedly, she enjoyed her time in hiding. It was the most peaceful, tranquil stretch of her life.
But it didn't last long. Amelia soon learned that William had lost his job and her family was hard up for money. So she returned to her family in Bristol and opened up her baby farm again. Worried the governess would be on her trail, she and William moved almost constantly, never staying at any address for too long.
But in October of 1891, Amelia's luck ran out. The governess finally caught up with her and brought the police right to Amelia's doorstep. But the confrontation wouldn't land Amelia in prison. Rather, she would land herself in an asylum.
Coming up, we'll see how Amelia's struggle to stay out of prison was only just the beginning.
Now, back to the story.
After a year of dodging the governess, 55-year-old Amelia Dyer found herself face to face with witnesses in October of 1891, flanked by police officers. They questioned her on the whereabouts of the governess's child, and Amelia struggled to provide answers. She reverted back to her original story about handing the baby to a couple on the train platform, but there were gaping holes in her story.
Regardless, neither the police nor the governess could provide evidence against Amelia, so there was little the authorities could do. No charges were brought against her, but the entire ordeal shook her, and she fell into hysterics.
Amelia began to relive her 6 horrific months of hard labor at Shepton Mallet, and it pushed her over the edge. That night, she attempted suicide. William returned home from work to discover Amelia writhing on the ground, slash marks across her throat. She claimed to be hearing voices urging her to kill herself.
For roughly a month, Amelia's daughter Polly was charged with looking after her mother as she experienced a nervous breakdown. William was away at work, so Polly became the sole caregiver. Amelia continued to claim to hear voices and even attacked Polly on at least one occasion.
Amelia likely suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a result of her 6 months in prison. According to Dr. Lee G. Thomas, symptoms of PTSD include, quote, reliving a traumatic event, avoiding anything which brings back memories of the trauma, abnormal jumpiness or irritability, feeling stressed out constantly, a low or depressed mood most of the time, and feelings of self-blame or anger towards some other figure supposed to be responsible for the present situation, end quote. The threat of possibly going back to prison theoretically made Amelia relive her time in Shepton Mallet and caused a mental breakdown.
But Amelia had also proven herself to be smart, calculated, and manipulative. She had witnessed the mental deterioration of her mother and spent time working as a nurse in an insane asylum. She knew that life as a patient in an asylum was far better than that of an inmate in prison.
Despite being rattled by her time in prison, Amelia had never before shown signs of PTSD. It wasn't until the police came knocking that she suddenly fell ill, leading some to speculate that Amelia's mental breakdown was completely fabricated. If she could get thrown into the asylum, the police might ease up, or at least believe that she had no idea what happened to the governess's baby.
After weeks of Amelia's erratic behavior, William decided to call a physician and have Amelia looked at. The physician, Dr. David Bernard, believed that Amelia was a danger to herself and to her family. He referred her to the county asylum in Gloucester, 30 miles from her current home in Eastville, Bristol.
The process of admission into a Victorian-era asylum wasn't the easiest. Legally, a potential patient required 2 written certificates of recommendation from medical physicians and, in some cases, an order from the magistrate. But in practice, the system was abused. There's no record of a legal order by a magistrate for Amelia Dyer to go to the county asylum in Gloucester. Dr. Bernard's letter seems to have been enough.
Amelia arrived at the asylum in the middle of November 1891. Upon her arrival, Amelia's mental state drastically changed. No longer was she raging about voices or violently attacking the people around her. In fact, she was known for being quiet as a mouse. It appeared that Amelia was perfectly sane.
There's also a possibility that she was going through laudanum withdrawal. Laudanum has the capacity to make people extremely volatile and aggressive. And perhaps the stress of the police visit led Amelia to abuse more of the drug in the weeks following, when her behavior went downhill. Once in the asylum, Amelia could no longer take laudanum. As the laudanum wore off, it may have affected the way Amelia acted while in the asylum, numbing her to the world around her.
Life in a Victorian mental asylum was one of routine. Amelia would be given 3 meals a day, at 7 a.m., 12:30 p.m., and an early evening meal before bed. Usually it was tea and bread. When she was receiving treatments, Amelia would be forced to work indoors, either in the laundry room or the needle room.
Since knowledge of mental health was still vastly misunderstood at this time, the key form of treatment for residents would be to try to relax them. The daily routine was seen as a way to keep patients from becoming too aggressive and irritable. It was boring, but it kept Amelia out of trouble and out of prison. She rather enjoyed it.
But her stay at the asylum wouldn't last long. She quickly recovered, and by January of 1892 was discharged and back in her home.
She moved back to Totterdown, and feeling the governess business was behind her, immediately opened up a farm. And though it might seem ludicrous given the circumstances, throughout 1892, the number of babies she took in increased. It seems that at this point, Amelia was addicted to the money baby farming brought in the same way she was addicted to laudanum.
Around this time, Amelia and William's relationship was beginning to strain. To Amelia, William had always been a step down from her first husband, George. She didn't value him or his opinion, as became evident when their daughter Polly began a courtship with a man named Arthur Palmer. Arthur was a few years older than Polly and was something of a dandy. He owned a store for those with expensive tastes. In due time, Arthur sought out William's permission to marry Polly. Instead, Amelia gave her approval without William's consent.
She largely ignored William, focusing instead on her farm. Throughout 1893, Amelia continued taking in baby after baby. The house is said to have been littered with them. Amelia, always one step ahead, managed to evade any kind of attention, but that changed in December of 1893.
Days before Christmas, Amelia Dyer opened her door to discover a ghost from her past. To her shock and horror, the governess and her husband had come calling. It had been nearly 2 years since Amelia had last seen them. Somehow, they managed to find her, and they still wanted to know the truth about what happened to their child.
No one knows exactly how this meeting went. The fine details are, like much of Amelia's life, lost to history. It is known that the meeting was short, and when the governess and her husband left, Amelia went for a bottle of laudanum. Polly claims that Amelia went out and returned with enough of the drug to kill someone.
Amelia was genuinely scared, and this time it seemed like her intentions to commit suicide were real. Amelia had a nervous breakdown. She downed a lethal amount of laudanum. William ran for 2 doctors, who Amelia suddenly and violently attacked. It seems that when Amelia realized her suicide attempt had failed, she immediately pled insanity. As the doctors tried to subdue her, she claimed that the voices were telling her to hurt them. She even said she was hearing non-existent birds. The doctors had seen enough. They recommended she return to the asylum.
With the magistrate's approval, Amelia Dyer was committed to the Somerset County Asylum in Wells.
But in less than a month, she was released. By the end of January 1894, Amelia had returned home, although the family reunion would be short-lived. For whatever reason, Amelia decided to leave William, taking their children with her.
For the first half of 1894, Amelia moved from house to house, never settling down long enough for anyone to find her. The governess was always on her mind, and yet Amelia continued to take in babies. She refused to find any other means of income. But if Amelia thought that the constant moving would be enough to lose her arch foe, she was wrong.
4 months after returning home from the Somerset Asylum, Amelia was once again confronted by the governess and the police. Once again, no charges were brought, and like a vicious cycle, Amelia tried to make her way to the asylum. However, this time she forewent the nervous breakdown.
Instead, Amelia went directly to the Somerset County Asylum. Though the asylum allowed Amelia to stay the night, the attending doctors didn't find cause for her to be admitted and sent her away. Disgruntled, Amelia reached into her bag of tricks and decided to do what always got her out of trouble: attempt suicide.
This attempt, unlike previous attempts, was clearly for show. Amelia tried to drown herself in a body of water that barely came up to her skirt. She was feigning insanity, discovered by police officers, quote, in an excited state, and taken to the Bristol General Hospital.
For 2 weeks, Amelia was under observation, but ultimately released. The doctors noted that she was clearly suffering from melancholia, but there was no reason to admit her into any kind of asylum. It's clear Amelia was using the asylum as a security blanket, but that doesn't mean that every one of her symptoms was faked. According to Project No, an American addiction research resource, a side effect of laudanum addiction is dysphoria, marked by depression and anxiety. It is possible that Amelia was using more laudanum than usual, which could have led to genuine melancholia.
Either way, Amelia had another breakdown and told Polly and Arthur that she was going to drown herself.
She was admitted to the Gloucester County Asylum at Wotton. As with her other stays, this one wasn't for very long, though she would later claim the experience broke her spirit. Her exact treatment isn't known, but it seems to have stayed with her for the remainder of her life.
Amelia was released from the asylum in March of 1895, but it didn't mean she was entirely free. Although Amelia had made decent money as a baby farmer, the almost constant moving and life as a single mother had proven expensive. Amelia was destitute. For the first time since her late teens, Amelia found herself impoverished. After officially pleading poverty, she was sent to the Barton Regis workhouse in Bristol.
Life at the workhouse was monotonous and hard. She spent her days weaving, breaking stones, or picking oakum. It was bleak and backbreaking.
Staying at a workhouse, though hard, would at least provide her with a place to sleep. Polly and Arthur had since married and moved far away to Plymouth. Because of this, Amelia had no place to go, though it is possible that Amelia chose to remain destitute for the time being in the hopes of remaining incognito. The governess was always on her mind. For now, in the workhouse, she was just a 59-year-old pauper. It was miserable, but safe.
However, safety was never enough to quell Amelia Dyer's love of money. It seems that all the while at the workhouse, she was plotting her return to baby farming. With Polly and Arthur gone, she would need to find a new assistant. She found that help in the form of a 70-year-old pauper named Jane Smith.
In a moment, we'll meet the woman who provided Amelia some temporary relief before causing her a world of pain. Now back to the story.
In 1895, while living at the Barton Regis workhouse, 59-year-old Amelia Dyer met Jane Smith and immediately knew that she could seduce this timid, elderly woman into helping her start her next baby farm. Jane was a widow who relied on the workhouse to survive.
When Amelia told Jane about her baby farming operation, she convinced her that it was a noble and virtuous profession. They would be helping young girls unburden themselves. Jane Smith bought into what Amelia was selling. Amelia even promised that the two would live together for the rest of their days as sisters. Jane Smith was in.
They left the workhouse and moved in together in fish ponds. Almost immediately, Amelia began running ads for babies. It had been too long since Amelia had seen any kind of real money. Right off the bat, she took in as many babies as she could.
Naturally, Amelia never told Jane about the killing aspect of their farm. When Amelia left the house with one baby and returned with a different one, Jane thought that was part of how it worked. She trusted Amelia fully.
The scheme Amelia orchestrated was that of a mother-daughter family business. She convinced the susceptible Jane to let Amelia call her mother or Granny Smith. It reassured the young mothers that they were dealing with two sweet, harmless old ladies who would find loving homes for their unwanted children.
Amelia kept to her old tactic of moving from house to house every couple of months. She refused to let the governess interfere with her work again. At some point, they moved to 45 Kensington Road in Reading, Berkshire, along the River Thames.
For almost 30 years, Amelia Dyer had managed to successfully evade capture for murdering upwards of 300 babies. But all things must come to an end.
Eveline Marmon was a 25-year-old barmaid who gave birth to little Doris Marmon in January of 1896. In March, she placed an advertisement in the paper seeking a wet nurse. Right next to Eveline's advertisement was one from a Mrs. Harding looking to adopt a child for a married couple. Quite the fortuitous coincidence.
Mrs. Harding, one of Amelia's aliases, answered Eveline's advertisement and convinced Eveline that Doris would be in good, capable hands with her. For several weeks, Eveline and Amelia corresponded, and Eveline grew ever more pleased that she found the right person to care for her baby.
Amelia traveled to the town of Cheltenham to pick up Doris. When Amelia arrived, Eveline was shocked that the woman she had been writing to was in her 50s. It made her nervous. But Eveline's fears were put to rest when she noticed how well Doris took to Amelia. For the price of £10, Amelia took Doris and promised Eveline that she could come to Reading whenever she wished and see the baby. A few days later, Eveline received a letter of safe passage from Amelia. Eveline wrote back, asking how Doris was doing. She didn't get a response.
Amelia never returned to Reading with Doris Marmon alive. Instead, she took the train up to Willesden, just outside of London. It was here that she visited Polly. While at Polly's house, Amelia took a piece of tape, wrapped it around Doris's neck, and pulled until the baby stopped breathing.
The next day, Amelia decided to kill another baby in her care, Harry Simmons, while she was still with Polly. However, there wasn't enough new tape to tie around Harry's neck, so Amelia decided to use the same tape on Harry that she had used on Doris. Both bodies were then stuffed into a carpet bag and weighted down with bricks. She returned to Reading, and the moment the train arrived at the station, Amelia quickly made her way to a bridge over the River Thames and threw the carpet bag into the river.
Amelia was pleased with both of these kills. Sure, they had gone off without a hitch. Little did she know that her partner, Jane Smith, was growing suspicious.
In the months leading up to the murder of Doris, Jane Smith had begun to feel unsettled. The number of babies coming and going was becoming too much for her to handle. Why were the babies she was saying goodnight to replaced with different babies in the morning? Something was afoot.
While on a stroll one day, Jane passed a shop displaying photographs in the windows. Jane felt sick as she realized that the images were of babies that had been abused. Little did she know, Jane had stumbled upon an office for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The NSPCC was a recently created organization whose purpose was to protect children from harm.
Jane broke down in tears over the images. The wife of NSPCC officer Charles Bennett saw Jane through the window and went to console her. Jane told Mrs. Bennett about the strange goings-on at her home, that she was beginning to think her friend had not found the disappearing baby's adoptive parents. Mrs. Bennett assured Jane that her husband would come and investigate. From that moment on, Charles Bennett became Amelia's shadow.
Weeks later, Amelia's house began to smell foul. Jane was the first to notice it, but Amelia said it was nothing. The stench only grew.
Amelia knew the source of the smell. It was the body of Helena Fry, a baby Amelia had adopted for £10. For some odd reason, Amelia didn't dispose of Helena's body right away. For roughly 3 weeks, the body sat decomposing in a parcel in the house.
In the early hours of March 30th, Amelia finally took the foul-smelling parcel with Helena's rotting corpse and threw it into the Thames. In an act of pure carelessness, Amelia didn't check to see if the parcel had sunk. She simply walked away.
Later that morning, a local bargeman guiding his cargo along the river noticed something floating along the bank. Using his hook, he retrieved the parcel from the water and opened it, curious. As he unwrapped the layers of brown paper, it slowly revealed parts of a human foot and leg.
The bargeman rushed to the authorities. Constable James Anderson, a Reading police detective, finished unwrapping the parcel with a surgeon and uncovered the remains of Helena Fry. They were horrified to find the baby with a piece of tape tied around her neck, a clear indication that she was murdered.
Constable Anderson noticed a label for the Temple Meads train station in Bristol inside the parcel. Upon further inspection, he soon discovered handwritten markings that, luckily, weren't affected by the water. The note contained a name and an address. Mrs. Thomas, 26 Piggott's Road, Lower Caversham, Reading, Oxon.
26 Piggott's Road was an address that Amelia lived at during the early weeks of 1896. Constable Anderson went to the Temple Meads train station, and a clerk was able to identify not only the parcel wrappings, but also tell them that Mrs. Thomas had moved to 45 Kensington Road.
Constable Anderson and Sergeant Harry James began conducting their investigation. Neighbors on Piggott's Road confirmed that Mrs. Thomas was a former resident, and that there seemed to be a steady stream of babies coming and going through the house. More interesting to the police, however, was that the former resident was also on the radar of the NSPCC. The pieces were falling into place, but not wanting to scare their suspect away, the police decided on a sting operation.
In the first days of April, the police attempted to set Amelia up using a young woman looking to arrange an adoption. But Amelia was out of town visiting Polly. 2 days later, on April 2nd, Amelia returned and met with the police decoy. The two struck a deal, and a baby would be delivered the next day.
But on April 3rd, Good Friday, Amelia wasn't visited by a young woman looking to have her baby adopted. Instead, she was met by Constable Anderson and Sergeant James.
The police raided the house and discovered evidence against Amelia everywhere. Spools of tape, baby clothes, a tin can which, judging by the smell, was clearly a place a strangled baby was stashed. Anderson and James were disgusted and arrested Amelia on the spot. The next day, she would be charged with murder.
The police discovered letters that led them to Polly and Arthur. Believing Arthur was an accessory to Amelia, the police arrested him too, despite protests of not being involved. A month later, Polly was arrested after accidentally revealing her own baby farm operation that resulted in the death of a child.
In the following weeks, more bodies were discovered in the Thames, including the carpet bag containing Doris and Harry, Amelia's final two victims. 50 babies were discovered in the Thames between Reading and London. Amelia told the police, quote, "You'll know mine by the tape around their necks," end quote.
Upon hearing of Arthur and Polly's arrest, Amelia began to panic that her crimes would catch up with her daughter and son-in-law. In a strange, rare act of kindness, Amelia Dyer wrote a confession that exonerated Polly and Arthur.
But she still tried to avoid the hanging that was in her future. During her trial at the Old Bailey, Amelia pleaded insanity and claimed that it was hereditary. She even cited her numerous asylum visits over the years as proof. Doctors who examined Amelia's mental state claimed that she was far from being insane.
The most incriminating testimony against Amelia was when a man testified to having seen her arrive at the river with the carpet bag that contained Helena, but watched her leave without it.
It took the jury 4.5 minutes to deliver their verdict: guilty. Her sentence? Death by hanging. On June 10, 1896, Amelia walked to the gallows at Newgate Prison. Her executioner, James Billington, asked Amelia if she had any last words. Amelia responded, quote, "I have nothing to say," end quote. With that, Billington put the bag over her head and noose around her neck. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Amelia Dyer swung. The Redding baby farmer, as she would be labeled in the papers, was dead.
Amelia's trial and execution brought a public outcry for stricter regulation on adoption.